How is the theme of class shown in An Inspector Calls? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video I am going to discuss how the theme of class is presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. I'll explain what I mean by that theme, analyse quotations that are relevant to it, and also discuss why Priestley might have included the theme in his play. Remember that discussing an author's possible intentions could contribute to you achieving the top grades. Please make sure that you have got a pen and some paper out in front of you so that you can take notes of the things that I say over the course of the video, as most of them won't be appearing on the screen. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if this video helps you out, as that helps me out loads too. Right, so what exactly is class? So class is a way of categorising people in a society. These categories are largely based on a person's social status or economic status. The three main classes in 1912 were the working class, middle class and upper class. If you want more details about what is meant by that, I recommend that you check out my contexts video, a link for which should be appearing on screen about now. So in thinking about class, we can think about how different classes appear, so how are the upper, middle and working classes presented, but also how they perceive and treat each other. Of course, the question you may face might not explicitly ask you about class, but here are some alternatives. Your exam question might ask you about social class, which is more or less exactly the same thing as class, to be honest. It could also ask you about wealth. The analysis in this video will be relevant given that wealth is intrinsically connected to class. The more money you have, the more likely it is that you will be in the middle or maybe even upper class. And if an exam question asks you about status, then the analysis and discussion in this video will also be relevant. In 1912, the upper class had the highest status, and the working class, unsurprisingly, had the lowest. So now that we have discussed what a theme actually is, I guess it's time to actually analyse some quotations. Our first quotation comes from Mrs. Birling. She says, "All right, Edna, I'll ring from the drawing room when we want coffee." This line of dialogue displays an interaction between a middle-class employer and their working-class maid. It appears that Mrs. Birling really only does view Edna as her maid or servant, rather than as a fellow human being, as within her dialogue there are implied commands and expectations. Because Mrs. Birling uses the verb ring, it is suggested that she cannot even be bothered to find Edna and ask her face to face to do things for her, but will possibly use a bell or some other audio cue to summon and alert her, creating the impression that Mrs. Birling sees herself as being superior to Edna. Mrs. Birling's dialogue also implies that she expects Edna to do what she is told when she is summoned, as there seems to be no doubt in her mind that Edna will bring the coffee when she rings for it. Now, this quotation does not necessarily depict a very positive example of the relationship between the middle class and the working class, but it is important to note that this is probably very normal for 1912. The middle class may not have viewed the working class as people, but instead as subhuman beings who served them. Our second quotation comes from Mr. Birling. Referring to the sort of people he employs, he says, "Rubbish! If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth." The slightly euphemistic and condescending phrase, "these people," already gets across some of Mr. Birling's stance regarding the working class. He looks down on them. Digging a bit deeper though, we can see that this quotation has more to it. Mr. Birling expects that his working class employees would ask for the earth. This idiom suggests that he thinks that they are greedy, and so perhaps this might show that the middle class employers may have had a negative view of their employees. The thing is though, Mr. Birling may not fully understand what the working class would do, since, to our knowledge, he has never been working class. It is almost as if he is projecting his own feelings and saying what he would do if he was in their position. Perhaps it is Mr. Birling, or the middle class more generally, who are greedy. Secondly, Mr. Birling seems to think that it is his position to come down sharply on the working class. He seems to think that it is his place to reprimand and control them, to teach them how they should or should not behave. This highlights the sense of superiority that Mr. Birling, and perhaps by extension the middle class, has, especially when he considers the working class. Our next quotation about class comes from Sheila. She says, "But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people." Now what Sheila says might seem obvious to us. Her father's employees are human beings. Yet the fact that she has to explicitly state that they are people, and apparently stresses it so much that the noun warrants italicization, there must be some deeper meaning. By stating something that seems so obvious to you or I, Priestley has implied through Sheila's dialogue that the senior Birlings, and perhaps therefore senior members of the middle class in 1912, do not regard the working class as people. This is another example of classism or elitism in the play. The middle class seem to have fairly comfortable lives, but that does not make them particularly decent people. Next up we have a quotation from Mrs. Birling. She says, "I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class." Now I've already analysed this quotation quite a bit in my Mrs. Birling video, a link to which is appearing on screen about now. So if I've included this quotation for both a character and a theme, I would say that that makes it a pretty key quotation for the play as a whole. Anyway, rereading this quotation from a more explicitly class-focused angle, we can see in this quotation that Mrs. Birling perpetuates class divisions. Rather than seeing Eva as a fellow human being and trying to empathise with her, she embraces the barriers placed between them by their different social classes. This is apparent in the quotation on screen through its use of pronouns, with the I and we of Mrs. Birling and Sheila seemingly excluding Eva, who instead belongs to that class. Indeed, the phrase "girls of that class" is a bit euphemistic and derogatory, as if Mrs. Birling is actively voicing the fact that she looks down on the working class. So in this quotation, we have a middle class character who seems to relish and perpetuate the class divisions of 1912. And yet very shortly after the last quotation, we get this one from Sheila. She says, slowly, carefully now, "You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl." So here we have a character who seems to display the opposite viewpoint to the last quotation. Whereas Mrs. Birling seems to perpetuate the class divisions of 1912, Sheila seems to reject them to an extent. She acknowledges that she and her mother belong to one class and that Eva belongs to another, as seen in the phrase "between us and that girl," but her rejection of these boundaries is apparent in the modal verb mustn't. This is an incredibly strong negative modal verb, and it indicates just how strongly Sheila believes that divisions between the middle class and working class should not exist. Here, Priestley has made his presentation of the middle class less one-dimensional. Not everybody in the middle class is an arrogant snob. Some of them are sympathetic, conscientious, and warm. In describing Eva's time at the Palace Bar, Gerald provides us with our next quotation about class. He says, "Old Joe McCarty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his." Now, old Joe McCarty, or Alderman McCarty, is an incredibly minor character. We know very little about him, but his title, Alderman, gives us a hint about his class and social standing. An alderman is an elected member of the local council, second only to the mayor. Because of this, I would assume that Alderman McCarty is middle class. A working class man would not have been elected to a position of authority like this in 1912, and I also don't think that an upper class man would be elected into a position that is less powerful than the mayor, which is a position that we know a middle class character can attain, as we know that Mr. Birling was the Lord Mayor of Brumley a few years prior to the play beginning. If anything, being an alderman would also be a step down for an upper class character, I think, as they would likely be a lord or lady or so on already. Anyway, this incredibly descriptive quotation presents the middle class in a very negative way. Obscene fat carcass is incredibly evocative and overwhelmingly negative, whereas goggle-eyed and had wedged her into a corner present Alderman McCarty as a sex pest. It is clear then that the middle class are capable of disgusting behaviour that people might otherwise usually associate with the working class, and so through his creation of a relatively minor character, J.B. Priestley has asserted that the middle class are not the saints that they would like to present themselves as being. As a quick side note, it is interesting that this quotation, one of the few quotations that are openly critical of the middle class, comes from the mouth of an upper class character. It makes me wonder, do the upper class look down on the middle class in the same way that the middle class look down on the working class? Perhaps class divisions lie on either side of the middle class. Our next quotation comes from Mrs. Birling. In describing Eva's request for support, she says, "She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position." So in this quotation, Mrs. Birling says that Eva could not hold elaborate fine feelings and scruples due to her social class. Scruples, for what it's worth, is a noun that describes a feeling of doubt based on the morality or propriety of something. It is implied then that Eva was trying to behave in a moral or principled way, presenting her and the working class in a positive light. However, by describing this moralistic behaviour as absurd, Mrs. Birling asserts that the working class are incapable of behaving in this way. This says less about the working class and more about the middle class. Mrs. Birling, a middle class character, is so prejudiced against the working class that she assumes that they cannot behave morally, implying that she thinks that the entire class is immoral, seedy, and subhuman. Therefore, the adjective absurd shows the class prejudice that some of the middle class hold. They think that the working class is immoral and subhuman, which also implies that they think that their own class is pure and righteous and superior. And our final quotation comes from the inspector. In his final speech, he says, "There are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths." The inspector's dialogue contains hyperbolic repetition. millions and millions and millions. The effect of this is that the working class is deemed to be unimaginably massive, which heightens the misfortune of Eva's suffering, because it is not just her own and is instead conceivably experienced by the masses. Here, Priestley's use of language evokes a strong sense of pity in his audience, as the immense suffering experienced by Eva has been multiplied by an unimaginable amount. Furthermore, by using generic names, Eva Smiths and John Smiths, to represent the working class, Priestley has stripped them of much of their identity, which reflects both their sheer numbers and also the little attention that the middle and upper classes pay them. So now it is time to consider J.B. Priestley's intentions, which should help you to achieve the top grades in your exam. Just like with characters, you can analyse themes with this in mind. So why did Priestley make class a theme of An Inspector Calls? It didn't just happen by accident. To be honest, when thinking about what Priestley's intentions may have been, I kept on returning to the same idea. Throughout this play, Priestley has put a spotlight on social class in order to highlight the rampant class inequality present in 1912. Whilst the middle and upper classes had life relatively easy, the working class toiled and suffered. Through his presentation of the working class as decent folk and his simultaneous presentation of the middle and upper classes as being problematic and often unpleasant, Priestley was querying whether or not it was right for the working class to suffer as much as they did. The middle and upper classes are routinely presented as flawed, as they engage in immoral behaviour and are shown to be selfish and prejudiced, which is far from the perfect image that they have of themselves. And so Priestley, maybe, was inviting his audience to have a moment of introspection. Were they as perfect as they believe themselves to be, or were they every bit as flawed as the Birlings and Gerald? Simply put, Priestley highlighted class inequality because he firmly believed that it was wrong. His socialist views rejected the prevalent ideology that it was every man for himself, and instead embraced the idea that each individual should do all they can for the benefit of others. By exposing the flaws of the middle class and upper class in the past, Priestley was hoping that his audience in 1945 would learn from these mistakes and work towards a more harmonious, caring, equal, and socialist future. So that is my discussion of the theme of class in An Inspector Calls done. But what could you do next? Well, if you're after some more quotations, you could look at how the upper class is presented. Gerald is our primary upper class character in the play, but his parents are mentioned in the opening few pages. What do we learn about the upper class? What do we learn about the upper class's view of the middle class? What do we learn about the middle class's view of the upper class? For that last question in particular, you might want to think about how we know that Arthur looks up to Gerald's parents. You could also watch my video about Eva Smith, in which I spend quite a bit of time talking about class, and the same with my video about Edna. Both of these characters are working class, and as such, much of my analysis of them is through a class-based lens. Now, whether or not you choose to do any of that, you could also like this video if it's helped you out. Leave a comment on it, either letting me know how useful it has been for you, giving me some of your own analysis, or asking me a question. And of course, if you haven't done so already, you could make sure that you are subscribed to my channel too. But whatever it is that you choose to do the rest of your day, I hope that it's an awesome one. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So there we go, that is how the theme of class is shown in J.B. Priestley's play and in Spectacles. But which one quotation do you think best presents that theme across the play? Please do let me know down in the comment section below. Cheers.